Hi, and thanks for hitting the snooze button. I'm Neil Headley. So I was prepared to write off a literal lifelong battle with insomnia to just being a part of doing more than 30 years of morning television and radio. When I dug a little deeper, it turned out there was far more to learn. So in this series, we try to help people fix their sleep, including you. By figuring out why mine is so horribly broken, maybe we stumbled upon some answers together. Now, as we get into this week's episode, I have to issue sort of a mea culpa here. If I'm being honest, when everything exploded with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, I thought long and hard about shutting this podcast down, and the website, and the book that's attached to it. Just shutting the entire project down, because I thought to myself, how can I realistically expect that anyone is going to be thinking about sleep right now when the world has gone to hell? Then I was reminded of a piece of research from about a year ago now that was one of the pieces of science that I wanted to talk about since this project got underway. And as you'll hear, for some unknown reason, it kept getting pushed to the back burner, and now I know what that reason is. It's because the conversation has never been more relevant and never been more important than it is right now. You're about to meet Dr. Dayna Johnson from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University in Atlanta. And as we speak, Atlanta is quite literally burning. But Dr. Johnson and I had this conversation on Friday afternoon, so you'll hear us get into great detail on the impact that race has on sleep. Yes, race has an impact on the quality of your sleep. I'll give you a heads up that toward the end of our time together, I bring up a nugget from Dr. Johnson's study that quite literally makes me angry, like literally angry. There's also a second part to this week's episode because starting this week, Dr. Michael Grandner from the University of Arizona will be part of the show every week, talking about the latest science from the sleep world that has emerged over the course of the last 7 days. So before we get there, a pretty stunning interview here with Dr. Dayna Johnson. So everybody that has ever been on the show, including my friend Michael Grandner, who I understand is also your friend Michael Grandner, who's coming up toward the end of this week's show, he's been asked this same question 5 times because the standing rule is you don't get to come on the show unless you get this question. So forgive me, it's the same first question that everybody that's ever been on gets, and it goes like this. How did you sleep last night?
Oh, I slept wonderfully.
Oh, that's good. Okay, that's the best answer I've ever gotten.
I actually have quite amazing sleep patterns. I remember when I first started in the field as a doctoral student and I was learning about sleep, I started feeling so guilty when I didn't sleep enough. And then the more I read and learned more about the negative consequences, I made it a habit. So my husband and I both have very strict sleep patterns. So I slept very well last night.
If it ever happens where there's a night where sleep doesn't show up for you, what do you do? What's your go-to?
Yeah, which has happened. Usually when I don't sleep well, it's typically something's on my mind. You know, it's some level of stress that I've dealt with from that day. So usually what I do is I will just get up and I'll write down what's on my mind. You know, what's keeping me up. I write it down. I put it there and I just try and go back to sleep.
Interesting idea, writing it down.
I write it down. I find that taking it off of my mind, putting it on paper kind of takes it off my mind.
It frees up what David Allen would call psychic RAM. I don't know if you've ever seen the book Getting Things Done, but David Allen that wrote that book refers to psychic RAM, where the minute you write something down on a piece of paper, his theory is it stops taking up space in your brain and frees up your brain to focus on other things or to choose not to focus on other things.
I totally believe that. And it's usually what we're doing is we're ruminating, right? We're just thinking about things over and over again. So if I'm, really thinking about my next day, it's easier for me to just write that list. Exactly what I need to get done the next day or whatever it is. And I do usually feel better.
It's funny. We had this conversation, Michael Grandner and I, a few episodes ago, where we talked about this idea of, I think the way Michael described it was, I can remind myself 37 times to remember to pack the carry-on bag for my flight the next day. But at some point around time number 25 or 30, I probably should have been able to step back and go, is it really useful to keep thinking about this?
Right. That is exactly right. I took a class maybe about 2 years ago, and it was focused on how to be more productive. And one of the tips was, instead of, constantly thinking about, I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do that, if you just make that note, it frees up that mind space. But also, if you just get it done, then it also, helps in terms of your productivity with other things. So that's the other piece. If there's something that I'm like, oh, I really need to get this done or get that done, sometimes it's just easier for me to get it done because I won't sleep well, because I'll continue to think about it throughout the night. So it's just easier, if I needed to look at something, let me just go ahead and look at it then.
I am staring at, as we sit down this afternoon, staring at an article that I have wanted to talk to you about for pretty close to a year now. And I'm amazed how many back burners I seem to have while a million other things compete for my attention. But this review that you and a team of other researchers put together about a year ago now, I'll give people the title. It's simply this: Are sleep patterns influenced by race or ethnicity, a marker of relative advantage or disadvantage, the evidence to date? And as I read through it, I remember it was one of the first studies as I took this project on almost a year ago now, that I thought, I didn't even stop to think that different groups by race might be having different experiences with things like insomnia or other sleep disorders. But at a time right now where, as you and I talk, the entire planet is finally having a very long overdue conversation about race, this is just yet another of the things that has jumped to the attention of all kinds of people who are saying this is just another thing that we need to pay attention to. Because it's interesting, as COVID-19 took over the public consciousness, there was a lot of talk in the sleep world about sleep being declared the next global health crisis. And then COVID-19 came along. But since COVID-19 has come along, people are also now pointing to race and racism as being the next global health crisis. And so you and I are sitting down at an interesting time to unpack this study, because there is a lot in here to address a lot of different race groups.
Right. You're right. Yeah, I totally agree. So we've encountered these issues over time, issues meaning that there's racial ethnic disparities in health. And there are several articles that have talked about some of the fundamental causes that are contributing to health disparities. And so the way I have framed my work is really looking at sleep as one of those contributors to overall health disparities, particularly racial disparities.
So is it a scenario, and I mean, like I say, there's a lot to unpack, and we'll get into all of this. Is it a scenario where, like so many other things, sleep feeds the other health problems, and then the other health problems also feed the bad sleep, which then continues to feed the health problems, et cetera, and there's this downward spiral?
Right. So I like to think of it in terms of a pathway. Right. If we think about a mechanism, there's certain things that happen. So if we think about as relevant to the current times, racism or even discrimination. So those things tend to be stressors. So when you encounter or experience discrimination or experience an act of racism, you have a physiologic response, a stress response. And so then that can affect your sleep. And then when we sleep, there are many things that happen that are important for our health. So whether it's hormone secretion and whether it's rest for our blood vessels, whether it's our memory consolidation, when we have a disturbance to that, it causes our sleep to be disturbed, and then we have a poor health outcome. So if it's memory, we're thinking about cognitive decline, for example, or if it's some damage to our cardiovascular system, we're thinking about a higher risk of hypertension or cardiovascular disease. And so if we have some groups or some populations, such as African Americans, that are consistently encountering discrimination and racism, other stressors, they're regularly at this experiencing the stress at this heightened level, and then consistently have disruptions to sleep, which interrupt these other factors. And so it's a linear effect. So one thing happens and then another, and then, it affects your health overall. And so that's why I target sleep and thinking about it on the pathway, as well as some of those earlier determinants such as racism and so on. But it's just one additional factor.
So how much of these disparities in sleep duration, sleep quality, all those sorts of things, and again, there's a lot to unpack there still, how much of that is environmental versus how much of it is simply a race-based disparity?
So that's interesting you separated those two. And so most of my work is actually looking at what I call environmental determinants. And so environmental determinants are really social. So where we live can affect our health in many ways, including our sleep health. And so where we live is dictated by our social status. So where you live is based on your income, it's based on your position in society. And fortunately, we're at a place now where we have lived beyond some of those laws that occurred many years ago, things like redlining, which dictated people could only live in certain areas. So certain populations, African Americans, were denied mortgages and the ability to live in certain neighborhoods. And so these neighborhoods have different factors and structures. So things like our exposure to air pollution, violence, social cohesion, all of these factors that can affect our sleep and our health. And so all of those things are really dictated. So I talked about some of the historical relevance, how we ended up in these environments. So we can think about residential segregation as dictating our environment, which relates to our health now. So all that to say, I really consider them, the same. These social and environmental, factors are what's really, contributing to a lot of these disparities that we're seeing in sleep. And so to be a little bit more responsive and specific to your question, the environment plays a very strong role in our sleep. And so in terms of how much is variable. So a lot of the research that we're doing is really targeted trying to quantify these things. And so what's the challenge with that is our environments are constructed of many dimensions. So you have your physical environment. So those are things like sidewalks in your neighborhood, which we know directly relate to your ability to walk. So the walkability of your neighborhoods, which relates to physical activity, which relates to obesity, which relates to sleep. And then there's other factors such as neighborhood safety. So how safe you feel at night directly relates to your sleep. And so our environment explains far more or dictates far more of our sleep, and particularly sleep disparities, than genetics. So I often, when I give talks about neighborhoods and sleep, usually my first or second slide is basically saying that our zip code is as important, if not more, than our genetic code.
Wow. Forgive me, I need to let a second for that to sink in, because that's
sure. Sorry, I probably said a lot there.
No, that's massive, because I'm sure that there are people who would look at, if someone were just to walk up and say, well, yes, there are disparities in sleep quality, sleep duration, all those sorts of things that are very significant. They have a very significant correlation to race. And there are people who would make the assumption, well, then that must be common among all people of a certain ethnicity. So that disparity, for example, must exist among all Asians. That disparity must exist among all Black people, et cetera. But what you're telling me is, if I'm understanding it correctly, that no, actually, if you boil it down, most of the difference can be attributed to some sort of social disparity or another along the way.
Right. And so the other piece that we have to remember when we're talking about racial disparities, and, in this, in relevance to this interview, is racial disparities in sleep, is race is a social construct. So when we're talking about race, we're really using that as a proxy for people's experiences. And so there's no genetic reason, right, that I should sleep different than someone else. There's some genetics around that. But in general, we find that our need for sleep is pretty consistent across racial groups, Americans, I would say, more specifically. So whether or not someone has additional experiences that changes that is something else. So because of your skin color, you have certain experiences, certain things like discrimination. And so regardless of your socioeconomic status, you can have experiences. So I'm a college professor. I am regularly in environments. I'm also an African-American woman. I'm regularly in environments to where I am the minority. And so that can cause a level of stress as well. So there's a term called John Henryism that is applied to these different stressors. So when you are in these positions and you're continually working harder, whether it's to prove your status or whether it's for other reasons, but you're consistently working harder. And so that takes a toll on your body physiologically. But again, this all starts with your social experiences because of your race. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes total sense.
Okay.
And if I may, let me take a very brief off ramp and then get right back to our original conversation. But what has that been like for you personally to be an African American woman in what for the longest time was a very white male dominated branch of science?
Yeah, I would argue it still is. It's been interesting. I will say I have been very fortunate on one hand to have mentors who, some of which belong to that group, who have used their privilege to make sure that I have good experiences and that I'm not treated unfairly on one end of this. So I'm very, very lucky to have some of those experiences. The other piece of this is that I do encounter a lot of what we call microaggressions, whether it's addressing me by first name while addressing my colleagues by Dr. So-and-so, whether it's, assuming I have made it to a certain point in life because of affirmative action or assumptions, other assumptions that are clearly, not correct. So I have dealt with a lot of those microaggressions, whether it's at, my place of work or whether it's at a conference. The part of this that makes it easier to cope with. But let me be clear that none of these are okay. At a certain age, many of us, meaning many Black children, are unfortunately prepared for what they may encounter. My parents were very honest with me at an early age, and I went to predominantly white schools. And so many of these experiences, I honestly expected to happen. And so when they occur, which is extremely sad, I'm not necessarily surprised. What helps me currently is I have amazing friends and colleagues that, we can talk about these things and let them go. And so for some of these situations, I like to think that people aren't trying to be intentionally harmful, but many people have an unconscious bias. They have these views about certain groups of people. And so the good thing about what's happening current day is that people are able to reflect on what's happening. There's an amazing thread happening on Twitter right now called Black in the Ivory, and people are sharing their stories of microaggressions, of racism, and so on. And I've talked to some of my white male colleagues, and they were really struck by these stories and surprised and deeply saddened by what they were seeing. And as we have, this is the other piece, we can have these conversations now. So while I'm having these conversations and being able to talk about how different things are perceived, that helps. Being able to have this partnership where we all take a role in addressing our privilege and addressing our role in racism. Whether it's individual racism, institutional level racism, it exists. And, unfortunately, we being African Americans, and I should really just speak for myself, I have figured out a way to cope. But that's not to say that there has not been a physiologic toll that is played. So we know from data that African Americans have a lower life expectancy, a younger life expectancy than other groups, particularly non-Hispanic whites. We have a higher prevalence of many chronic diseases such as hypertension, and we're also more likely to have uncontrolled hypertension. And again, I'll say that's despite socioeconomic status. So we don't find that income is relatively protective for our health. So meaning these other exposures like stress are taking an additional toll beyond what we can protect using income. And so there's other things, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned my friends, but really network, social support is so important.
Is there a connection to be made? And I'm known for exceeding the bounds of sensible thinking and science on occasion, so forgive me if I go far astray here. Is there a connection to be made between the prevalence of sleep issues in, for example, the Black community, and also the way that COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting that community? Because we've had many a sleep expert on this show already talking about how important sleep is as one of the pillars of your immune system. And so, there's this talk about how if your sleep is suffering, then your immune system is suffering and you're more likely to pick up things like COVID-19. Is there a connection to be made there?
Right. So we don't have the data to support that yet, but I would say it's definitely likely. I actually recently co-authored a perspective with one of my colleagues, Dr. Chandra Jackson, on sleep disparities and COVID-19 disparities. It was published, I think, just a few weeks ago in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. And in this article, we talk about that. We talk about how COVID-19 could potentially we could see more or a wider gap in racial disparities in sleep. And then it can work the other way. So meaning because of some of these other, because of these sleep disparities we're seeing, so certain populations sleeping less, they're more vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19. But what I'll say, again, is going back to these fundamental reasons why we have these. So the same reasons why we're seeing these a higher rates of COVID-19 in certain populations are some of the same reasons we're seeing sleep disparities. So for example, racial minorities are more likely to be essential workers. And so those same racial minorities are the ones that are more likely to be shift workers and also more likely to live in these neighborhoods where they have more exposure to toxins and so on that can affect their health. And we see that with COVID-19, a lot of this is about access, being able to get tested or being able to even receive a referral by your physician to be tested and having facilities close to where you live and not have transportation be a barrier. The same thing happens in sleep. So meaning in urban neighborhoods or even lower SES neighborhoods, socioeconomic status neighborhoods, we're less likely to see practicing sleep physicians. And so then when we talk about getting a sleep test, you're talking about staying overnight somewhere, right? So we're talking about a certain person who can stay overnight somewhere and be away from their family or take time from their job. So that's another mark of privilege. So we're talking about a high rate of undiagnosed sleep disorders. And we're seeing the same thing with COVID, right? We're seeing people reporting symptoms but not having a diagnosis. And so in the article that you mentioned at the start of this call about the essentially racial disparities, I talk about an article that I wrote previously, which looked at sleep apnea among African Americans. And we saw that there was this high rate of not only the prevalence of sleep apnea, but a high rate of being undiagnosed and untreated. So in fact, we found that 96% of the people with sleep apnea were unaware they had this condition, which, translates to a number of consequences. So you have sleep apnea, right, which is this condition where you have an obstruction, either partially or completely in your airway. You stop breathing, several times per hour. So you have this constant awakening, and that relates to having a poor sleep quality. So that next day, you're tired. You have a high rate of sleepiness. So then what are the consequences of sleepiness? You have a higher risk of accidents, both occupational as well as motor vehicle accidents. Sleepiness is also related to things like cognitive decline. It affects our mood. We can all think about times of when we're sleepy and how we feel. It can affect our diet. It can affect our decision making. And so it's a whole line of things that happened, subsequent things that happened after that. But I just wanted to draw those parallels between COVID-19 and sleep disparities. They're very intertwined, and we will likely see that, this other effect. But again, it's the same factors that are contributing, which are social factors that are contributing to these disparities.
Before we get, and I'm going to come right back to where we are now in about 10 seconds, but before we get too far away from it, you mentioned the term unconscious bias, and I want to illuminate for people listening, if you've never taken it before, I need you to Google a term, Project Implicit. It's a survey that you can take online. It's an online test that they developed at Harvard that will identify for you, and it will it grants you the luxury of revealing the results to you privately, because the results for so many of the people that take the test are eye-opening and embarrassing, if not shameful. If you go to Project Implicit, you can, with this test that they developed at Harvard, identify whether or not you have a certain level of unconscious bias. And by unconscious, it means that you are biased in a certain direction and weren't even aware of your biases. And so if you Google Project Implicit or just go to implicit.harvard.edu, all the information about it is there. I wanted to make sure I threw that into the conversation before we got too terribly far away from it. I want to get back to what you've been talking about in terms of cognition, because it rings so many bells with, for example, the second episode of this show, which was focused exclusively on sleep and cognition, with Dr. Adrian Owen from the University of Western Ontario, who did what at the time, 6 or 8 months ago, was labeled as the world's largest study of sleep and cognition, and talked about the impact that just even a little bit less sleep per night gives you. And we talked about it in terms of, you brought up decision making. And decision making, people seem to think that it has these large scale ramifications, buying and selling a company, a house, this or that marriage or whatever. But decision making as well, and the kind of decision making that can be most impacted by sleep, is simple things like, is now a good time to change lanes on the highway?
Exactly. It could be the changing lanes. It could be, should I have a candy bar or should I have a salad? It can be, should I take my medication now or should I not? Do I remember to take my medication?
And so when you boil down sleep duration alone as part of your review, and you shine a light on the difference between the white community and the black community in terms of even just sleep duration, and there's almost a 48-minute difference there on an average night, and you think about, I think to myself, what I wouldn't give every night for 48 minutes of extra sleep. But this is just baked into the experience every day for the black community.
Exactly. And, another, just to drive home that difference, think about sometimes when people wake, they hit snooze, right? So snooze is usually 8-10 minutes, and they tend to feel a little bit better. Right. So just having that little bit of time. So think about 48 minutes, how much you can get done during that time. So it's actually quite a wide gap. And so, and it's really problematic. And I think you're specifically talking about for certain groups. But I also want to highlight, so I've talked a lot about African Americans, which tends to be the majority of my work. But there's other populations that we talk about in that article, racial minorities. We talk about Native Hawaiians, Alaskan Natives, and so on, who are also getting very, very short or sleeping very short periods of time and have poor sleep quality. And so we're seeing this across several groups, Hispanic populations, Asian. And so I just wanted to, add that point.
Yeah, because as you start to go through, I'm focusing on one specific paragraph in this entire review that it talks about, on average, sleep duration 399.5 minutes in the black community. Then, very close behind, the Asian community, 409 minutes, Hispanic, 411, and then there's this enormous gap after that from all those racial minorities. Then a whole half an hour later are the white people. And here's the other thing that jumped out at me from this review that you did, and it speaks so much, and it's, on some levels, it makes me angry that out of all of these different populations, the white people, who are the ones that get the most sleep, are also the ones that complain the most about how little sleep they're getting.
Yes. That is very true. And so this would actually be a great conversation to have with Michael. So the complaint piece is really getting at insomnia symptoms. And so Black people, or at least in the studies that we reported, tend to underreport insomnia. So they underreport problems with sleeping. And so that's for many reasons. And so our article that Michael has talks about how the way the questions are phrased, they're phrased in a way that implies judgment. And so there's some social desirability there. So meaning you don't want to be perceived as lazy. And I want to just add a little bit more historical context here. One of my colleagues at Emory, Ben Reese, he wrote this book called Wild Nights. And he also talks about, he's a historian, really. He's the chair of the English department. But he talks about some of the reasons for sleep disparities, which date back to slavery times, where pictures of Black people sleeping were labeled as lazy. And so this stereotype has emerged that if you sleep enough, so really the amount that you need in order to be healthy and operate and have a good quality of life, implies that you are being lazy. And so when we find that when we give some of these questionnaires that even touch a little bit to any level of judgment around sleeping, that it tends to get underreported. So they're more likely to say, oh, I don't have any sleep problems. You know, the quality of my sleep is great. But then when we measure it, we see, as you have mentioned, in comparison to the white sample, their sleep quality is far worse. So they have a lower sleep efficiency, more wakefulness after sleep onset, a longer sleep latency, so meaning it takes them longer to fall asleep, but are less likely to report that as a problem. But again, it's all because of that historical piece and trying to do, what's best not to perpetuate stereotypes at sometimes your own detriment.
Yikes. There's so much to unpack from this study alone that has, I think, so much to contribute to the conversation that is going on now all over the planet about race. And in some ways, I'm glad that you and I didn't get a chance to connect until now, because I feel like your study might even be more relevant now than it was when it came out a year ago. And I don't know if that's occurred to you or not, but it's just one of those where there's so much here that I think puts a lot of this into perspective, that you've got certain racial minorities that are at a disadvantage before they even get out of bed from things that are so completely beyond their control, and it's upsetting. I'm sorry. There's a moment or two where I've heard you describing some of this where I had to mute my microphone for a second because I was getting choked up listening to it. And so that there are people like you out there that are shining lights on this. And you even tell me about the new research that came out a few weeks ago. There are so many conversations about this that need to happen that I'm grateful that you're doing the work, and I'm glad we had a few minutes to sit down this afternoon and shine a light on this, because this will add a lot of context to the conversation, I think, for people.
Thank you. I think this is a good time in society because they're listening. People are acknowledging what is happening. We are seeing evidence right in front of us of what's been happening, really. It's just now it's at the forefront. And so if we can take this time and realize, how poor sleep in particular, disproportionately affects certain populations, and there are things that we can do to address that, it's our responsibility to do that. health should not, or having good optimal health should not be based on your race.
Yeah.
We all should be afforded health and healthy sleep patterns. And so we have to do what we can to accomplish that for everyone.
Well, and it's interesting, too, just as one more thing to throw into the conversation and for people to think about, there is that segment, that privileged segment of the population who, if insomnia is on their radar, they have to look at things like buy a different mattress, get a fluffier pillow, those sorts of things. And there are massive segments of the population for whom sleep is a much bigger problem, that a new mattress or a new pillow is so far down the list of things that need to change. Exactly. Wow. I feel like a better human being for having had the chance to listen to you talk for half an hour. Thank you for this.
Thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me to talk about something that is very important and something that means and matters a lot to me. So thank you. That's Dr. Dayna Johnson from Emory University. A link to the specific study that we talked about is waiting for you on our website at thesnoozebutton.com. Now, on to the first in a series of regular appearances from my friend Dr. Michael Grandner from the University of Arizona. Except this conversation took place under kind of unusual circumstances. All right, Michael, you've been on the show almost as many times as I have, so you know the drill by now. You know question one is coming at you and it's unavoidable. Now, there's current events probably playing into the answer to this question. How'd you sleep last night?
I slept okay. I didn't go to bed as early as usual because we had some stuff going on at the house, but woke up around my normal time and getting through today okay.
Okay, so let's talk about the stuff going on at your house. Let's peek behind the curtain for a second, because as we sit and record this, you are literally looking out the window and trying to figure out if you are about to be evacuated because there are forest fires near you.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's the thing with Arizona, where we don't get much in the way of hurricanes and tidal waves, but we do get fires. And there's a fire up on the mountain that's north of us, and we got some pretty incredible pictures last night that really didn't do it justice. We can see it pretty clearly. We're still hopefully far enough away that we're going to be safe, but we've got people less than a half a mile from us that have been evacuated already. So, we've got a bag packed and we'll see what we have to do.
Okay, so I'm guessing this is going to test everything you've ever learned about sleep, because if I'm in your shoes right now, I can't imagine how I'm going to be able to quiet my mind enough to get to sleep tonight. Do you have a plan for that?
Well, so this was last night where, even inside the house was smelling a little bit smoky, and so we're like, all right, what do we need to do? We're certainly not going to stay up all night, and we need to get to sleep, because if anything needs to happen in the middle of the night or tomorrow, we want to be as rested as possible. So, we double checked everything around the house, made sure everyone knew where all the fire extinguishers were just in case we needed a path somewhere, and kept one nearby. And, knowing that we weren't in the zone that was likely to get more immediately evacuated anyway, just, kept the phones nearby, and it took a little bit longer to fall asleep than usual, but eventually did, and here we are today. And the good thing is, the thing that I always tell people is that things will happen, and losing some sleep once in a while is normal. I don't think I've ever met anybody who's never lost sleep over anything ever. And the key isn't to avoid that at all costs. The key is to get to the point where you're resilient to it, where, my sleep is good enough that, give me a couple nights to be worried, and I can handle that okay without being thrown for a loop. We'll see what happens after a couple nights. We'll see how much they get contained today or tomorrow or by the weekend. We'll play by ear. But I mean, that's the key, though, is, one of the things I told myself was, okay, what can I do? Let me do everything I can. Sitting up worrying is not helpful. Actually, the most helpful thing I could be doing right now is sleeping after I've made any preparations and did whatever, signed up for whatever alert systems there I needed to sign up for, check the county websites and all that stuff. All right, I did everything useful I could do. There's literally nothing else I can do right now that's helpful except for get some sleep. And that was one of the things I would tell myself, as I was trying to fall asleep, you've done everything you could. Now the most useful thing you can do is just take a deep breath and relax and be prepared for tomorrow.
Is this useful? That phrase that came up last time you and I chatted, which I feel like is about 5 or 6 weeks ago now. And I had so many people reach out after that aired and talking about that, adopting that phrase. Is this useful going forward to try and get rid of the things that might be keeping them awake? So,
and it's legit. I mean, that's what I did last night. Like, what can I do to be helpful right now? And I did all that. And then what can I do that I can obsess a little bit and check all the news, make sure I didn't miss anything. But like at some point, it was like, look, there's nothing else I can do that's helpful right now besides actually get to sleep. And that actually made me feel better about sleeping. It helped me let go because I knew that what I was doing was actually proactive and investing in success rather than just being reactive and just obsessing.
So Michael is going to be a guest on the show on a weekly basis going forward, and we picked an interesting week for you to do this to sort of kick this off. You're just kind of taking the temperature of where sleep research is.
There are no weeks this year that aren't interesting. There are no weeks this year that haven't been interesting in some way.
You can say that again. And so, I don't know if as you're literally staring out the window at the smoke, you've had a chance to sort of reflect on the things that have sort of crossed your radar in the last week or so that you found interesting or compelling or that stuck out to you.
So, a lot of stuff is starting to come out regarding sleep and COVID. A lot of the early studies are starting to trickle out, and they're really interesting to see. And there's a few in particular that have jumped out. One is looking at using a big survey data set, looking at sort of what had happened to sleep duration and sleep timing this came from a European population. This was from, I think the senior author on this was Christian Kayochin, but basically what they were looking at is how people have been processing their sleep during this time on average. And it's interesting to see that for all the stories that people have, what is happening with the plurality of people. And so that's sort of interesting to see. Then there's a few studies coming out also looking at, in particular, sleep and mental health. And looking at how important it is, how important sleep is and mental health is during this time in particular. That right now a lot of people are stressed out, and some people are sleeping more, some people are sleeping less. The ones that are having more trouble with sleep are the ones that are more stressed out. And this connection between poor sleep and mental health sort of feeding onto each other seems to be something that's happening in a subset of the population. And I don't know, there's been a bunch of things coming out from a couple different groups looking at this. Of course, I can tout the one that I helped out with that was led by Scott Kilgore, showing that increased anxiety about COVID led to increased suicide ideation, and that the degree, and that was largely explained by how worse you were sleeping. So if you were sleeping worse, that tended to drive some of those poor mental health outcomes. But there are other studies that are looking at similar things. So that's sort of what's been jumping out to me, what I've found really interesting, because in my mind, there's a whole infectious disease story here, but at my core, I'm not an infectious disease person. Like, I'm a mental health person, and I care about where people are at in their life and their story and all the things that are going on right now and how people are dealing with it. And it's really interesting to see that there are these subgroups of people that are dealing with this in different ways, and they're important.
But it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, as I continue to remind people, I'm just a layperson who has a bunch of really smart friends. It seems to me that these things feed off of each other, so that it's like the three-legged stool. If you think of your immunity to COVID-19 as one leg of the stool, your mental health as it relates to suicidal ideation is another leg of the stool. You pull sleep out as that third leg, and both of those things can suffer, can they not?
Exactly, and that's the idea, and especially from the perspective that sleep itself is relatively modifiable, where there are things you can do to help yourself sleep better, that are probably more readily accessible than other things you can do in other domains of health, which makes sleep very convenient, where you can do things tonight to be sleeping better tonight, right? As opposed to mental health, where it might take a little more time, or there might be things you can do in general. But I just see sleep as not just an important leg of the stool, but also a door that's slightly more open maybe than some of the others, where it's hard to talk yourself in or out of relaxing, but you can, by changing your behavior, whether you feel it or not, can improve your sleep. So I think that's one important message for everything going on right now, is that everybody has had their sleep change. I don't think I've talked to a single person in the last few months whose sleep has not changed at least a little bit, in one direction or another, periodically or regularly, something. I think there's something pretty amazing about how universal that is. And I think that shows that this is an important aspect of this whole experience. That yes, infections and lung function and how it impacts the heart and the brain are all probably more proximally important. But how it's impacting sleep might be more universally important, because who knows what's going to happen a year from now? How is this going to change things? Not just in terms of how people's sleep patterns are going to change, but also how does this change society's interaction with sleep, where you have many people who now don't have to get up so early to commute to work. You have a lot of kids who didn't have to get up so early to go to school. You have people staying up later than they used to. You have variability in sleep decreasing, where we don't have as much of the weekday versus weekend difference in people. And that's one of the things that this that this paper out of Europe showed, was that to some degree there's a change in how we relate to our own sleep and our own scheduling, and I wonder how much of that's going to stick. Some of it, I bet some of it will, at least a little bit.
Do you think that what's going on now and what we've done as a result of COVID-19 is going to make it an easier case to get children's school times pushed later? Because I know a lot of states are still working on it. California has adopted it. They're phasing it in over a long period of time. But do you think that's going to make an easier case?
Well, one way that I think it might is we have now put a whole bunch of adolescents through a natural experiment of what happens when we delay school start times. And if anyone's tracking information, and they can model things like mental health or something over the time, and you can see the degree to which someone's sleep was delayed a little bit or got lengthened a little bit or something, can you model how that maybe made them more resilient against something? I mean, the data is out there somewhere. People are collecting it, and all it takes is a few people to look at their data set under this lens to say, rather than do this one school district at a time, one intervention at a time, what happens when you look at the population level? So if you say added 20 minutes at the population level, that doesn't sound like much, but if you then improved outcome, I'm just making up numbers, if you improve outcomes by say 5%, on a person-by-person basis, it doesn't seem like much, but moving 5% of the entire population of millions of people you're talking about not only thousands of people who have their academics improve, graduate versus not, people who are getting, who need care versus people who don't. I mean, you're talking about huge changes with relatively small movements of the needle when they're happening at the population level. So I guess my answer is, will this help make a better case? The data that would help it make a better case is probably out there, and there are people collecting it, and I'm really excited to see what comes out.
Would it be easy, and this is where this question is going to get people who do what you do for a living and all the other science nerds rolling their eyes at the idiocy of the question, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Would it be, I would think it would be really easy at this stage, when so many people are still working from home, when you've got kids that may or may not even be going back to a school building come September, I feel like it would be easy to use something like, for example, the cognitive tests that are over at Adrian Owen's website at Cambridge Brain Sciences, where we can actually do tests of cognition on a website, and you can repeat the test a bajillion times over, and we could just flood the internet with that test and get all kinds of people from every walk of life from all over the planet taking that test. And you say we're putting kids through this interesting study. We could actually make it an official study and have people, when they clock in for school or clock in for work or whatever, invest a couple of minutes in answering the questions about last night's sleep. We figure out how much sleep they got. They do a quick test of cognition, and then they're off to the races with the rest of their day. How hard is it to do something like that on a big scale?
Either not at all or very, I guess. But no, I'm saying this sort of half jokingly, that I think you're right that there's a huge opportunity for big data, for being able to collect big data here. What it requires, if you have the capacity to do something like this, having a large-scale data set like this could be relatively easy to put together if you have the capacity, and if you have the infrastructure in place. And there are some people who are doing stuff that's very similar to what you're saying. Like this European study that I was describing was sort of similar, where they already had this infrastructure in place. There's a great study coming out of mostly out of Boston College, and that one is going to probably be one of the better ones that comes out, because they were one of the first to start, and they're tracking people with a whole bunch of measures over time. But I'm sure that the study you're talking about is existing somewhere, probably a couple different places, though probably not at the scale that you're thinking is possible. It probably is possible. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm just saying there's probably a bunch of these out there where people are leveraging their existing infrastructure to have people do tasks. But you also bring up a really, really important point, that what would be extra compelling is finding a way to not just ask people subjectively about sleep and their experiences, which is the easiest thing to do, and it's the best way to get large numbers of people, and it's not useless data, it's still useful. But being able to pair that with some sort of testing. And you're right that there are online test batteries that are good enough to be able to detect stuff like this, and at least in large numbers, that it would be great if people could be implementing this. Like, here's a link, click on this, spend 5 minutes doing this every morning or every afternoon or whatever it is you do, and track it over time. The key here isn't just finding lots of people to do it, it's looking at repeated measures and doing it a number of times, so you can see, as sleep went up, did this go up? As sleep went down, did this go down? I mean, you could look in lots of people cross-sectionally, where it's like people who slept more scored like this, and people who slept less scored like that. But it's much more powerful to look at change over time and how change predicts change.
If you're curious about a study like this one, and you're listening right now and you're thinking, I want to explore where stuff like this is being done, two things I'll suggest to you. One, go back and listen to episode 2 of this show, which is with Dr. Adrian Owen. Yep. And in there we talk about a study that he did with Cambridge Brain Sciences and the University of Western Ontario that literally involved hundreds of thousands of people who took these online tests of cognition, and those tests of cognition were put up against their own, what's the term I'm looking for? Their own evaluation of their own sleep. And they drew some conclusions from that. And from what I understand from Adrian, that thing is scalable. It's been scaled to a large degree before because of this huge project that Cambridge Brain Sciences did with the BBC. So I would point people who are interested in looking into this a little further in the direction of, I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but the website is real easy. It's cambridgebrainsciences.com, and you can look up right there on their website. They're free online cognitive tests that you can literally repeat day after day after day. And as it says on the homepage of their website, over 10 million of them have been performed so far, and more of them every day. And they're tests of cognition that have been used in hundreds of peer-reviewed studies. So it's worth having a peek at. But it would be fun, like you say, Michael, to get, I mean, this is a golden opportunity for big data if we can just figure out how to leverage the fact that so many people now are sitting in front of computers who might normally be spending that available time commuting or what have you. So it'll be an interesting challenge. I'd love to see somebody pull it off.
Yeah, there's also the Sleep Research Society website, which is just sleepresearchsociety.org. That's the main organization of sleep scientists. They also have in their news section, you'll see listings of ongoing studies, and people can search for announcements of sleep-based online research studies where people are trying to recruit people to just, let's get as many data points as we can while we can. And if you can search through Twitter, you can search through on the SRS's website. There's a number of studies out there, and so most of them are relatively low impact, where they probably don't require too much, but they usually want people to either fill out a survey or take some measures a few different times to track change over time. But yeah, this is a great time to get involved in research where you get to be part of the answer.
I'm going to let you go and deal with whether or not you've got to evacuate, but I do want to throw one other thing into the mix, because there was a study that popped up that crossed my radar. And I don't know yet. You and I have spent an awful lot of time sitting in front of microphones together, and I'm interested in the things that catch both of our attention. I think this may have been actually a study that you perhaps retweeted a link to. I don't know if you're where I got this study from, but it involves one researcher from Johns Hopkins and 6 from various universities and hospitals in Australia. And the title of the study goes like this: Cannabinoid Therapies in the Management of Sleep Disorders, a systematic review of preclinical and clinical studies. And basically what this review that goes through a ton of 14 preclinical studies, 12 clinical studies, and basically draws the conclusion that we don't know enough yet about whether cannabis, THC, any of those kind of products actually do a darn thing for anybody's sleep. Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, I know which paper you're talking about. It was in Sleep Medicine Reviews, which is basically a journal of where people summarize the literature in a certain area, and they write a whole review on the topic, a state-of-the-art review. And the thing about cannabis research and sleep is that my reading of the data similarly is that it's murky. It's not that it's clearly some sort of silver bullet, and it's also not clearly nothing either. There's something there, but it looks like it's complicated. I think it's more complicated than would be convenient. But it probably depends on the strain, it probably depends on the dose, it probably depends on the timing, and it looks like people have a lot of individual differences in how they process these things. So, like with caffeine, some people, they'll have a small amount of caffeine and it keeps them going all day, and some people can drink large amounts of caffeine to no effect. And like with, it just seems that here you have a situation where people tend to react differently, and so finding a systematic signal in a lot of noise is harder than you would think. And that's, I think, the take-home message from that study, which was, when we look at the whole landscape, the story isn't totally clear, is the message. That, it would be nice if it were clear, then we'd know what to do. It's not clearly good, it's not clearly bad, it's a little murky. And our task, and I say the royal hour, like the task of the research community is, let's sort some of this stuff out and detangle some of this stuff and figure out what works, what doesn't work. But clearly a blunt approach isn't the best way because it's going to be super noisy.
Did you actually just say a blunt approach? Really?
Sorry. Seriously?
Oh, that was gold. I'm keeping that. That's
on that note.
Yeah, exactly. Well, best of luck with the rest of your evening. I hope to be able to report nothing but good things going forward, and I hope you get to stay put, and that the biggest problem for you over the course of the next few days is how to get the smoke smell out of the house. My fingers are crossed for you.
All right. Thank you so much. My fingers are crossed too, hoping we get to at least stay put and everyone stays safe and they get this under control. But, such is 2020. I guess I get to punch this hole in my 2020 bingo card.
Oof. There you go, my friend Dr. Michael Grandner, first of a series of appearances he's going to be making on the show, a regular guest every week talking about what's new in sleep science in the past week. Go to thesnoozebutton.com for not only the show notes where you'll find the link to the study that we talked about with Dr. Dayna Johnson about race and sleep, but you can also leave a question there for our panel of sleep experts. Easy way to rate and review the show. You can leave us your feedback. The links to all our social media profiles are there as well. And you can even support the show, if you like, with a donation to help keep it commercial-free, keep the doors open, as it were. If you're crunched for time but you love the information, there are 9-minute versions of every episode with a different podcast called The Snooze Button Express, and you can find it in the same app that you're listening to this one right now. Back with more next week. Until then, my name is Neil Headley. Hey, get some sleep, would you?